was a patient who had several times broken up the ward in this mental hospital. And this nurse knew about the importance of going into the person's model of reality. And she was aware that very often violence, say, in the context of a mental hospital, is actually triggered off by members of staff inadvertently contradicting patients' models of reality. Not surprisingly, that provokes aggression from them, because people will die to defend their model of reality. That's why we've seen 3,000 people die in Northern Ireland. Two different models of reality. To an outsider, quite similar. But yet people will die to defend their models of reality. Now, what this young nurse did was she calmed this patient down on this day just as he was about to break up the ward again. This particular man suffered from the delusion that he was Bruce Lee, kung fu fighter. So rather than challenging him, she said, "Excuse me, master." First time he'd been addressed as master. "Excuse me, master," she said. "Do you remember you were going to show me how to do these breathing techniques that you know about?" And the patient looked a bit confused because nobody had ever acknowledged his delusion before, his model of reality. She said, "Master, can you come and show me how to do this breathing technique?" And so he followed her. The patient sat down and she sat down. And she said, "Wasn't it like this, master? I'm supposed to breathe into a count of 7 and breathe out to a count 11. Watch me, master, and tell me if I'm doing it right." And so she demonstrated the technique. Then she asked him, "Master, can you please show me how you do it?" And he obligingly started to breathe into 7 and breathe out to 11. It took a couple of minutes, and the guy was completely calmed down. She had transformed the situation by stepping inside his model of reality. In fact, we know from one of the world's greatest psychotherapists, Milton Erickson, that this, again, is an incredibly valuable technique in dealing with all kinds of mental illness, including psychotic mental illness.
Yes, there's a wonderful example of Erickson being shown into the room of a psychotic patient who believed that he was being pursued by rays. He was very paranoid, and he blocked up all the windows and the doors, cracks in the walls, in an attempt to stop these evil rays from getting to him. And Erickson went into his room. First time the chap had experienced anybody who had entered his model of reality. He said, "Ah, good," he said, "I see you've blocked up all the windows and the doors. There's one thing that worries me. You hadn't actually blocked up the cracks in the floors." And he panicked, and Erickson got down on his hands and knees and helped the chap stuff newspaper in the cracks in the floors. And from that moment, Erickson, because he'd entered his reality and partaken of his delusions, was then able to gradually lead him back to a normal life.
Yes, this technique could indeed even save your life in some contexts. I recall once I stepped into a tube train, and as the doors closed behind me, I noticed that there were about 6 young men in the carriage, and they were sprawled all over, legs up in the air, and they were drinking cans of lager, and they were talking about steaming the train. That is, that they were going to run as a group through the carriages and steal passengers' goods. And, of course, I realized I was in a very dangerous situation. And what I did was to immediately take up a similar position to these young men. I swung my legs up above my head, leaned back in the chair, and to see a middle-aged man taking up this position must have been some sight. But it held these young men in a state of confusion. On one hand, they could see I was behaving like them, but you don't often see a middle-aged man doing this. And so they just looked at me and looked at themselves and did nothing for the next minute. It took about a minute to get to the next station, at which point I jumped out of the train and beat a hasty retreat. But simply by matching them, going into their model of reality at that level, inhibited them from attacking me for sufficient length of time for me to be able to get out of the situation.
Well, I've heard you tell an even more extreme example about a woman who was being attacked by a serial rapist and murderer.
Well, that's absolutely right, Ivan. On this particular occasion, this man entered a shop where this woman was working, and she had an assistant there. First of all, he demanded money, and she intuitively sensed that this was a very dangerous character. And so she gave him the money in the till without hesitation. And then he started to describe to her how he was going to sexually molest her. And intuitively she knew that it was best not to get frightened. And she said to the guy, "That sounds very interesting." And the attacker looked totally confused. And he said, "You're not shaking." He said, "You're not shivering." And she said, "No." She said, "It sounds rather interesting." Well, the guy just grabbed the money and ran. And subsequently she learned from the police that this guy's modus operandi was to rob the women and then to get them full of fear and shaking and to beg for mercy. And this turned up his sexual arousal levels even further. And then he went on to actually murder and sexually abuse them. But because she had entered his model of reality, and because she responded from her intuition in an appropriate way, she derailed his trance state. And she saved her life. She also gave an accurate description to the police, which meant that this guy was subsequently arrested. But she was only able to do that by responding both at the level of intuition, because there's always a part of us that can register information the conscious mind isn't registering. Incidentally, in this context, we would, for example, say, urge people to tune into their intuition in situations that are potentially dangerous. For example, women nowadays will often enter a lift when they notice a man walk into that lift ahead of them, or he may be already there. Now, their intuition is telling them that this is a potentially dangerous situation. There's something about that man that frightens them. And yet, because of social mores, they feel they must go into the lift. Now, surely it would be better if they responded to their intuition and just let the lift go up. Okay, there's a few moments of embarrassment. They could even say something, oh gosh, I want to check something. And suffer that few moments of embarrassment rather than putting herself into a steel cage with a man she's frightened of. We need to encourage people to take back their common sense and to respond to their own native awareness and intuition in situations that are potentially dangerous.
And of course, anger is potentially dangerous, and we should use our intuition about other people's anger.
Well, indeed. I would sum this up in a way by saying anger is a gift from nature. Anger can direct us to situations that we need to change. But humankind has evolved and evolved further, and we now have multiple ways of dealing with the situations that we need to change. And it rarely requires us to become physically aggressive. Much more often, it is better to be able to take a cool look at what we are upset about and devise an appropriate strategy for dealing with it. So our anger can initiate change, but it shouldn't control our reaction to it.
Well, thank you, Joe. That's a very useful summary of what there is to know about anger. People wishing to explore the topic in greater depth, of course, can attend your seminar on the subject. But I think we can certainly say we have a much better grasp of what's going on now when people feel themselves emotionally swept away with these terrible feelings.
If you'd like details of workshops and seminars by Ivan Tyrrell, Joe Griffin and other members of the Mindfields College teaching staff on a range of topics including effective anger management, treating trauma and phobia, depression and anxiety disorders, call Mindfields College on 01323 811 440.